So I'd like to welcome everyone to our session today. Our special guest, Dr. Gereffi, students from my Global Disruption class, and those joining us from my Age of Globalization class. I'd also like to welcome other faculty, students, and guests from the GW community. Before we get started, I'd like to give a shout out to GW-CIBER for their help and support putting this event together. In case you're not familiar with the Center for International Business Education and Research, or CIBER, it's one of 15 such centers in the United States. CIBERs are supported by grants from the U.S. Department of Education with the purpose of promoting research, education, and outreach in the area of international business. The GW-CIBER serves as a resource for students, faculty, policymakers, and the business community by supporting research and teaching projects and by organizing programs and events like this one that enhance participants' understanding of various themes related to international business and trade, economic development, and the interplay between business, government, and civil society. For those of you at GW, I'd encourage you to get involved with our CIBER as they're a terrific group.
Look, I'm gonna go over there.
Sorry. And now on to our main event. Our topic today focuses around disruptions to the global supply chain, especially the medical supply chain during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we can learn from these events. What can business and policymakers do to build resilience to future disruptions? As you think of questions during our discussion, I'd ask you to post those in the chat, and we'll hopefully have time to answer some of them toward the end of the hour as time permits. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Gereffi to the GW School of Business today. Dr. Gereffi is a professor emeritus at Duke University and the founding director of their Global Value Chain Center. He's perhaps best known for his work developing the global value chain framework used by a variety of stakeholders in the business, policy, and development realms. He's worked with multilateral institutions like the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF, various NGOs such as USAID, as well as with many multinational corporations such as Maersk, Nike, Patagonia, and others that you would have heard of, all focusing on global value chain governance and the role of global value chains in development. Some of Dr. Gereffi's recent work that's garnering a lot of attention examines the disruption of global value chains for medical supplies during the pandemic. And since that work ties in nicely with the theme of my Global Disruptions course, I invited Dr. Gereffi here today to share his insights on this important and timely topic. Dr. Gereffi, the shortage of medical supplies, not to mention vegetables, dairy products, and toilet paper, came as a pretty big shock to most Americans. I know I was wondering, along with many others, just how we, the United States, have run out of PPE. Why were our medical personnel and care providers forced to reuse N95 masks and wear trash bags for lack of personal protective equipment? And why were we scrambling for ventilators? Walk us through what happened.
Great, Laura. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have not had a chance to visit GW officially, so it's great to be able to talk with the GW community virtually, and later I'll hope to visit your class in person sometime. This topic of global supply chains was something I've been interested in for a long time because I've been looking at multinational corporations. But once COVID-19 hit, it definitely became a matter of public discussion. As you say, not just medical supplies or personal protective equipment related to COVID-19, but all of a sudden we began to see images in the newspapers of farmers plowing under fields of fresh vegetables and spilling thousands of gallons of milk and breaking dozens and dozens of eggs. And it was all somehow being linked to the shortages or disruptions created by COVID-19. So in the course of the discussion, let me introduce 3 different ways we can think about supply chains in terms of how they relate to COVID-19. And then during the presentation, I'll give more specific examples connected to links to Asia and China and the role of face masks and things that are going on in terms of the US policy domain as we've tried to deal with these shortages. In general, when we think about supply chain shortages, I think there have been three broad approaches. The traditional business school approach has thought about supply chain linkages through logistics. As we've had the globalization of production beginning in the 1970s and really accelerating in the 1990s and 2000s, this idea of global factories that have their production facilities in many different countries became quite pervasive. And the logistics approach was to ask, how do we get goods across that supply chain moving with the speed, quantity, quality, et cetera, that are required. But one thing that isn't as well known, and this is what I think emerged during COVID-19, we have to remember that it was a very particular type of disruption. Supply chain managers or logistics people have to cope with disruptions and supply chain risks all the time. But usually those risks are localized in a particular place, might be a natural disaster or a weather event. What happened with COVID-19 is that we had global disruptions that were occurring simultaneously, both in terms of supply and demand. That was a totally unique event. People talk about, well, we haven't had something like this in 100 years. I think ever since the onset of sort of global capitalism in the 20th and 21st century, we haven't had anything quite like this. What happens in supply chains, however, is that we have retail supply chains and wholesale supply chains. And what was happening with fresh produce and dairy was that there's a supply chain that was geared from companies that were selling to restaurants, universities, businesses in large quantities. And that was the supply chain that became disrupted by COVID-19. The retail supply chain that was going to our supermarkets, where each of us would go individually, wasn't so disrupted. So we began to see these two different images. The wholesale supply chain, their customers were closing down, restaurants weren't able to serve people. So the goods that they ordered were no longer in demand. And I guess the key point is that we actually have different factories and farmers that are supplying the wholesale distributors versus retail markets. So that was one kind of disruption. More specific to COVID-19 and this topic of medical supplies was what we might think about as the supply chain structure approach. And that has to do with how rigid or resilient supply chains are. One thing that had happened in medical supplies, like face masks, which was a very good example, is that over the last 10 or 15 years, businesses have set up supply chains to focus on low cost production in large quantities, partly to meet this just-in-time business model that both companies were doing, but also hospitals were buying into. They did just-in-time buying the same way companies did just-in-time production. So to get personal protective equipment relatively cheaply, the US and Europe has had a supply chain that's been centered on Asia, particularly on China, but also in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, and other locations. And when COVID hit, a lot of those countries closed down their production and export of goods, and that led to shortages of things like the face masks. And what's come out in that debate is maybe we need to rethink this supply chain model and move away from the efficiency-oriented but relatively rigid supply chains and develop more resilient supply chains. And now there's going to be a big discussion, and we'll talk at the end, about what resilient supply chains look like. What are the different options to make supply chains easier to deal with these kinds of risks or disruptions? And then another topic that becomes quite important when we think about China versus the US is what's the role of the state in supply chain management? One of the striking features about China is that it's the leading exporter and producer of the vast majority of consumer goods we get in the West. But China's export-oriented development model has a very heavy influence of the state. In the US context, we have much more of a hands-off approach. And when we start looking at how China versus the US responded to the COVID-19 crisis, one of the few tools we had in the US was the Defense Production Act. And we'll talk about how that was used in the Trump administration and how that's been used in the Biden administration. So I think from a sort of a framework perspective, each of these three approaches, business logistics, supply chain structures, and role of the state, help us understand dimensions of the medical supply shortage. We can go to the next slide real quick. But what I also wanted to do in this article that I published last year in something called Journal of International Business Policy, and they did a special issue on COVID-19 and international business that a lot of your students might want to look at, is it's really important to look at the supply chain structure of different products. And we have a different structure for personal protective equipment like face masks, surgical gowns, rubber gloves, and other things that were important for the crisis versus more sophisticated medical devices. The personal protective equipment supply chain is heavily concentrated in Asia. The medical devices supply chain, including a lot of pharmaceuticals, is much more centered in the US, Western Europe, and Japan. And so what I wanted to do, and I'll briefly mention in the talk, look at different products, face masks, or a classic example of PPE that was in short supply. Ventilators were also in short supply, but it's a more complicated product, and that involved us using the Defense Production Act. And vaccines is what everybody's talking about today. And we have a different dynamic for vaccines. So I think when we use this kind of global value chain model, we have to be pretty product specific in order to understand what the different patterns are and what appropriate policies might be.
Great, thanks for that. So we're going to move into a little more detail. I'd like to get a little more detail on the US-China relationship, as it is so important. So we have this kind of emerging great power competition. We have a trade war, all these other things that are going on that has not made the response to the pandemic any easier. So Gary, you've spent a lot of time in China and studying China. So I would love it if you could share with us your insights into some of the US-China challenges, giving some thought to the question of, will we really be able to move our supply chains away from China eventually? And would decoupling from China even be a good idea? So do you actually envision an era of reshoring ahead? Is that feasible and is that desirable?
Great. Okay, so to provide context for where China fits, I'll give you a couple slides of what have been called COVID-19 goods. This pandemic has become so powerful that a lot of trade economists have begun to identify the kind of goods we see on this slide as all things that are particularly important in treating COVID-19 patients. And one of the things we see is the really broad geography of COVID-19 goods. Some of these products, like face masks or paper sheets, are centered in China, and China is the leading supplier. But other things like surgical gloves, they're mainly coming from Malaysia and Thailand. And other products, certain kinds of protective equipment, are coming from Mexico. So one set of products, mainly the lower tech, low cost items, are coming from developing countries, especially China. And other types of products like the patient monitoring devices we see up here are coming from US, Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, and other developed countries. So this just reinforces a point I was trying to make earlier. Low cost, low price PPEs coming from Asia, more advanced medical devices are tending to come from the advanced industrial countries. Let's look at the next slide. If we then look, and we'll focus for the remaining examples, let me focus on the PPE side of it, because I think that's where we've seen disruptions in trade for products that are particularly useful in treating COVID-19. If we look at this kind of a trade chart, one of the things we see is China's really key role as a leading exporter of these goods to the rest of the world. So if we look at all personal protective equipment at the top here, we see that both the US and the European Union import about 50% of our PPE from China alone, and then the remainder from the rest of the world. Whereas if we look at all other products, we see China's importance is more like 20%. So China is a critical supplier and they're dominant in certain product categories. But we have a lot of other key countries that are becoming important. For example, if we were to look at pharmaceuticals, generic medicines, India is the world's leading supplier of a lot of generic pharmaceuticals, and especially of vaccines that are being used for COVID-19. But China is a leading supplier of active ingredients for a lot of those pharmaceuticals. So we get really complex and important interdependencies between the different countries around the world. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to focus as a case on the face masks, because this is, I think, emblematic of a lot of the importance of personal protective equipment with regard to COVID-19. But there's a lot more product complexity, even in a relatively simple face mask, than we might think. So on this graph or slide, we can see two different types of face masks. On the left here at the top are these relatively simple, but they're called surgical masks that you can put on. But on the right, we have the much more sophisticated N95 masks. And we might recall at the beginning, February, March, already even Dr. Fauci was saying that we should be careful about buying N95 masks. We don't need them as ordinary citizens because they wanted to reserve those for medical personnel, but that the rest of us should be using at least these ordinary or surgical face masks. So I think, and there's a lot of great articles about how these industries work. So two different types of face masks: surgical, relatively simple, and N95 is more complicated. Let's go to the next slide. But even though both types of face masks are pretty simple and pretty cheap, the N95s before COVID, you could purchase them for under $1 a piece, and those surgical masks, you could literally purchase them for 4 or 5 cents each in bulk. And then we know how scarce they became. But a critical thing for a simple product is they may have a key technology input, and that's definitely true for the face masks. Their key input is the filter. What is it that's going to screen out all those particles or bacteria from COVID or other kinds of diseases? And the main input is a non-woven polypropylene fabric, widely used in a lot of other products like baby diapers, and disposable wipes, that's called melt-blown fabric or melt-blown PPE. And it's used in all kinds of these masks. It's interesting to note that prior to COVID, only about 10% of these face masks, including the N95s, were used for medical use. Most of it was construction and industrial use, where you're also going to be surrounded by particulate matter and you don't want to breathe it in. So there's a big market for these face masks. And even something like the N95 mask, as small as it looks, has 65 parts. So a critical part in understanding these production shortages is, where are all the parts coming from? The assembly of the mask is low tech, and that's why a lot of the assembly is being done offshore in low wage countries, but some of the key inputs are relatively high tech. So let's look at the next slide. And this is just an example of what that polypropylene melt-blown fiber looks like. And you can see that unlike the typical woven good, where you would have horizontal and vertical dimensions of fibers that would be neatly interwoven, the whole point of a melt-blown fiber is you have this scattered approach with extremely thin fibers. And now they're actually using nanomaterials to do the same thing. So this is one of the reasons why these filters were so useful in trapping the particles connected to COVID-19. Let's look at the next. Now, the question is, how or why did China play such a key role? We'll go to the next slide. And I think it's China's ability to scale up production and exports is unparalleled in the world. And just looking at the simple case of face masks gives us an insight into what China's production capabilities are and why it's become an export leader in so many industries that we rely on in terms of consumer goods and other types of products. So remember that the initial case of COVID-19 in Wuhan was discovered in late December, but it didn't really become announced to the world until about the second week of January. Once it was announced as something that we had to be cautious about, Chinese scientists within 2 or 3 days actually had published the genomic structure of this new COVID-19 disease to the rest of the world. And that's one of the things that helped vaccines come out within 7 to 9 months. The fact that the scientific community had a heads up once the political announcement was made that this is a serious problem. So in January and February, China was really ground zero for the cases. And it wasn't clear how fast or how far this disease was going to spread. So in those early months, China was actually importing from the rest of the world as many face masks as possible. But by February, China began to gear up its own extra production of face masks. And just look at a couple of these statistics, and then later you can kind of compare them mentally with the US or any European country. China's surgical face mask production, the simple ones, not the N95s, increased 12 times or 12-fold in just 1 month, the month of February 2020. So they went from making 10 million masks a day to 115 million masks a day. From March to May 2020, China started to go from producing for the domestic market to reopening its export supply to the rest of the world. So remember, we didn't start to see COVID-19 in the US until March, second week of March. So before mid-March, this was still a problem in the rest of the world. It wasn't evident that we were going to have to deal with this, but China started to export masks from March to May. It exported in those 3 months 70 billion face masks. Just think what a billion is. That's more than triple total world production of 20 billion masks in all of 2019. So China in 3 months tripled world capacity in the previous year. The number of Chinese companies registered to make and trade face masks were around 67,000. In our case, we could probably number it more in the hundreds. And a lot of the mask making machinery comes from other parts of Asia, China, Taiwan, certain things from Korea, Singapore. So a lot of these industries that China is the key exporter for, a lot of the parts come from other Asian countries. Let's look at the next slide. There we go. And so if we say, to me, a critical research question that I don't think we knew enough about, and we're still learning a lot about, is how did China do it? And I think the key, how did China scale up its production and its export of these face masks so quickly? We have to go back now to that melt-blown fabric. So the key for the face mask was being able to produce the fabric for the filters. And that was what was in short supply, partly because producing that is a very capital-intensive process. We have companies in the US and Europe and China that do that, but they do it for their own supply. Kimberly-Clark has that material for all the diapers that it makes, and 3M and Honeywell for their face masks, but it's a reasonable amount for their own needs. China scaled up its production of melt-blown, non-woven PPP fabric to 150 tons a day. Just to put that in perspective, again, tons a day. That's 5 times what China was making before the pandemic. So in a few months, they scaled that up by 5 times. That's 15 times the total output of all US companies' production of melt-blown fabric, even after they ramped up their production in the spring of 2020. So again, China's scale in terms of production and exports is even greater than the difference of its population versus other countries' populations. It has a production model that we sort of study in when we do the supply chain analysis that's unlike anything any other country has ever come up with. If you just think of other products like neckties or chairs or any particular product we can think of, China has supply chain cities where the whole city is geared to producing a key product, and all the parts suppliers locate around the city. So they take a model of integrated production and they scale it geographically. And factories like the Chinese factories that make iPhones, the Foxconn factories, those factories are about 300,000 people in size. And there's 4 or 5 of them in China alone. So China's got a scale, again, that we don't understand. But to me, the key was, how do they do it? If you talk to American companies, which was happening during the pandemic, and say to 3M or Honeywell, so come on, guys, can you scale up the production as well? Well, yes, they could. But the question for them is, if we're going to make these investments, what happens after the crisis is over and the demand subsides? Who's going to pay us back for that? So this kind of raises this question of, to me, not just what China did. This graph illustrates the type of scale up. Or if we go to the next slide, or we can sort of see how we did it, and that gets to the role of the state. We know that China has a very state oriented or state-driven economy, and they do a lot of development planning. And so one of the things that was happening in China, and a lot of this, again, is research that's come out from China specialists, it wasn't really clear to the international business community before people have been doing this more specific research. China centralized the coordination of PPE supply in a particular interministerial commission called National Development and Reform Commission. Before, it was done in a couple of specific ministries. Now, again, think about in the US context, we were using facilities like CDC, Center for Disease Control, or FEMA, or particular agencies. So the key here is, if you're going to have this kind of broad scale response, you need to have a centralized super ministry, essentially, that's coordinating all the different aspects of even the Chinese economy. They directed a couple of their big petroleum state-owned enterprises, 2 mentioned there, Sinopec and PetroChina, to begin to ramp up some of the production of PPE, because remember, polypropylene fabric comes from oil as a natural resource. So it makes sense that the oil companies might be in a position to make this. And so you can see that example there. Just one of those companies that added 2 lines of melt-blown fabrics in Beijing was producing 4 tons of fabric a day, which alone could make in just one day 1.2 million N95s or 6 million surgical masks. So again, the numbers are kind of mind-numbing until you would try to put that into a comparative perspective. But in addition to its state enterprises, China asked other companies, including a lot of the tech firms that are located in China, to add face masks to their production. So the Chinese government, when they ask, is really an order, of course. It's not the same thing that you could ask and then companies are going to say no. Whereas in the case of the US versus 3M, we had a lot more negotiations going on. We have a totally different business model and economic system that we can talk about. Just one of those companies, Foxconn, that makes all the Apple iPhones and other things, itself was adding 2 million face masks a day by the end of February, just for its 1 million domestic employees. So I think the scale up is a key to China's ability to play the role that it did. And if we just go to the last slide on the China case, this to me is an amazing slide, because it's showing that from January all the way through mid-March, when China was dealing with the outbreak of COVID-19 inside the country, it was doing everything it could to ramp up production for its own population, because the needs were so great. And face masking there, again, wasn't a voluntary kind of thing. Just ask governors or mayors to tell your people, maybe it's a good idea. People had to do the face mask. But by the end of March, look what was happening to China's exports of face masks. They start ramping up these exports. So each of those bars is referring to US imports of face masks. And we see we weren't importing very much up through March 20th. By the time we get to April 20th, our imports had shot up to whatever that is, 2 billion masks, whatever, much of which the dark blue part of the bar is China, light blue is rest of the world. So China had already re-entered the game as a key exporter within several months. Okay, so that's kind of the kind of story. We can come back to it, but it really is role of the state and how Chinese government relates to Chinese companies, state-owned, but also the privately owned or tech companies, many of whom are multinationals. Let's go to the next slide. And maybe we'll stop here because this is a China story, Laura. And I think if we want to switch, we then have to say, well, how does that China story differ from what might have been going on in the United States?
Yeah, and that's exactly my next question. We saw that during the height of this whole crisis, the shortage of PPE, the shortage of other medical supplies, the Trump administration begins basically pressuring large corporations like GM and 3M to produce ventilators and masks. And is that kind of stopgap measure really a viable strategy for the US? How does that compare to China's strategy? And is that a kind of precursor, that sort of level of government intervention in industry that we're not really accustomed to? And we have to really think about subsidization of our large corporations if we're going to sort of push them or force them to do this kind of turnover, because as you mentioned, it is expensive and who's going to pay for that? So is that going to continue to kind of usher in a new era of industrial policy, in your opinion?
So I think we have to take a couple steps back and go to that question we started with. How do governments respond to disruptions in supply chains? And if we think about the US context in particular, think about Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy or whatever, we have this agency of the government called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association or agency, whatever. And part of their key job is to move supplies or expand production in areas that have been hard hit by particular crises. It could be the wildfires in California or floods or any of those things, but typically localized in one part of the country where you can pull resources from other parts of the country to meet those needs. With COVID-19, because it was a public health crisis, we also had CDC becoming a very important player because they were the center for disease control, disease prevention and control. And they were another part of the government apparatus. But in particular, under the Trump administration, as we also know, there was a group, which was the White House. I mean, the Trump administration was very heavy on executive authority, as we know, and they wanted to move fast. And so eventually, quickly, by mid-February, the coordination in early March, coordination of the response to COVID-19 moved from CDC to the White House Task Force. Remember, Philip Azar had ran into some problems at the end of February because CDC was putting out a testing kit very early on. We're going to test for this. When it does come, the testing kits were flawed. They were contaminated. So CDC had made a big mistake. Mike Pence gets made the head of the coronavirus White House Task Force. And that's for the rest of the US response to COVID-19, it basically was run out of the White House. Health and Human Services, CDC, FEMA, all were secondary concerns. Now, in particular, this Defense Production Act, this was an act that came out in 1950 during the Korean War. I initially thought it was World War II or World War I. And the whole point of the Defense Production Act is it gives the government authority to require firms to turn over their capacity to make goods that are in short supply. In a wartime setting like World War II, often that is munitions. You know, if you're a coin collector like I used to be, you'd remember that a 1943 penny was made out of another kind of metal, not copper, because everybody in the government was requisitioning copper for other uses. So governments play critical roles in emergencies in trying to organize the supply chain, but we don't do it very often. In the case of the Trump administration, and we've learned a lot about the week-to-week decision-making going on in Trump, it's important for us to remember that at the very beginning, PPE and face masks and production were not at the top of the agenda of the Trump administration. The key item were vaccines. Vaccines were potentially the solution to the COVID crisis. That involved big, innovative pharmaceutical companies. And so that's where the Trump administration was putting its effort. And Operation Warp Speed, which ended up being spectacularly successful and having a couple vaccines by the end of the year, as we know, or by January, the Pfizer, Moderna, and now another one with Johnson & Johnson. That was the signature accomplishment of the Trump administration. But when we got to things like the shortages of of the face mask and the ventilators. That was where Trump was being pressured to use the Defense Production Act to get other companies to help produce those goods. Just a few points of how Trump did it. Finally, in March 27th, President Trump used Defense Production Act to order GM and others to produce ventilators, even more than face masks. Remember, face masks, the two top producers were 3M and Honeywell. They were ramping up production on their own, and they had gone to 4 and 8 times their normal production volumes between March and May. But for ventilators, it was a much, remember the N95 mask has about 65 parts. Ventilators have anywhere from 450 to 650 parts. So if you're trying to ask other companies to produce ventilators, you need to find manufacturers that can deal with complex production systems, which is why the auto companies were such a popular partner. So GM and Ford and General Electric were all companies that the administration approached, said, could you start to produce these products that we need? End of the day, yes, and ventilators, as we recall, step back, ventilators in April and May were the most critically demanded product because so many people that were getting COVID-19 were having to go into intensive care units. And in intensive care units, they were having trouble breathing. They discovered that this disease really compromised the lungs. So, April, March, April, May, and I'd say April, May, June, ventilators were the #1 product in everybody's mind. And so Trump used Defense Production Act to produce that and get these companies to come along. 2 things to keep in mind. When the companies agreed to do it, they agreed to do a certain amount for a certain price, but it's always considered temporary. We're going to do that to fill this need, and then we're going to walk away from the deal. I don't know what happened in China when you asked the China state-owned enterprises, how do they walk away from the deal? And even with 3M, the negotiations for face masks, the company is saying, look, we're worried about liability. If we start to produce face masks from other lines that were using it for industrial use and now it's being used for medical use, what if we get sued? That was a huge issue always with the face mask makers. So in the negotiations, the Trump administration agreed to give them that liability. With ventilators, it looked like it was a really successful story here because we had 10,000 ventilators in our strategic reserves around April, and the needs for states like New York were already considered to be 50,000. So we ramped it up. We've got 95,000 ventilators in our strategic reserve by August. So that was considered to be a great success, except that only 1,000 of those have actually been used for patients. Why? Because during the course of treatment, different ways were discovered to keep people out of ICUs. They don't need as many ventilators. So part of this problem of governments getting in to orchestrate production is that in many regards, the people on this team were real rookies. They hadn't done it before. So you overestimate. Now you've produced all these goods and all of a sudden there's no demand for it. Well, the companies are going to get paid because they have contracts. But in terms of, is this sustainable? Is this a sustainable solution going forward? How do we sort of manage these crises? Normally, what you're going to need to do is you'd have to have specialty commissions try to figure out what needs to be produced by whom. If we look at how the Biden administration has used the same Defense Production Act, it was in relation to this Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We just heard about it very recently. Johnson & Johnson had a vaccine approved, the 3rd one. They were producing a certain amount. Merck, another big pharmaceutical company, it was also introducing a vaccine that they decided to move offline because it was running into problems. So Biden has used the Defense Production Act to pay Merck to take 2 of its production lines and dedicate it to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So typically what you're trying to do with Defense Production Act is you're coordinating production among big US companies and getting them to do things that are needed. And you have to figure out how to do it with some kind of timetable and payment plan in place. So I think in the case of the Trump administration, we used the Defense Production Act, but with regard to ventilators, it shows the real difficulty of estimating supply and demand in a crisis. And if you're going to overestimate the supply, and now we have 95,000 masks in a strategic reserve, what are we going to do with that? And this gets into the question that we probably want to come to next is, what are the implications of how the crisis was managed in terms of the future. Does this mean that because of the COVID-19 crisis and because of our reliance on imports from Asia or other places of the world, we need to reshore industries, or sort of what's the post-pandemic approach to creating more resilient supply chains? So, but in terms of how we use this Defense Production Act in the U.S. in a much more limited way, because the role of the state, the federal government, is much less strong than in China. And I think in retrospect, our biggest failure at the government level wasn't production, it was distribution. And as we're seeing with vaccines, the huge difference between HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, versus CDC, two parts of the government, is that in Operation Warp Speed, when we were talking about vaccines, the whole purpose of that massive investment in 6 companies to try to get these vaccines produced was vaccine production, but not vaccinations. CDC is the last mile agency. They're saying, great, you produce the vaccines, but how do we know where to send them and how to set up vaccine centers in all the different states around the world? And remember, this distribution was a huge problem with ventilators. I think the federal government under Trump, their job was get something made, but leave distribution to be handled by the states. That's their problem. But in a crisis, those two things go hand in glove. You can't come up with a production strategy without also figuring out an outreach and distribution strategy, as we've been doing recently with the vaccines.
So, this is just something I was thinking of as you were talking. So we're not going to be China ever or anytime soon. We don't have that level of scale. We don't have a centrally planned economy. So what's plan B? You had sent me a great article about kind of coordinating with our allies, or coordinating with global partners to kind of produce an alternative strategy, because we're never going to get to that kind of central planning scale kind of thing that China does. So how do we pool our resources with like-minded countries to kind of fill that void?
So let's go to the next slide. Now we'll talk about that. I mean, it's a great set of issues. So I think the question going forward is, how do we effectively compete internationally? How do we deal with countries like China? A whole range of questions. China, I think, is effectively the largest global economic competitor to the US by far. And it's not just because of its scale or its ability to produce and export low-wage goods. It's also because China is very interested in high tech. They're interested in Industry 4.0. They're interested in the digital economy, e-commerce. So in a sense, the US competition with China isn't about goods production. And it isn't about trade wars where we're putting tariffs on goods coming across the border. To me, those are negotiating strategies or tactics in order to try to think about the next level of innovation. So in terms of a couple of your questions, we don't necessarily want to compete with China head on in terms of scale of production. Let them do that. Certain countries can produce scale. The key to the US economy and a lot of the other advanced industrial countries is innovation and R&D. And how do you produce the next round of vaccines? And how do you have the medical research that allows you to generate new ways of producing pharmaceutical products? And what's the next generation of semiconductors that's going to run our 5G network? So all of that innovation area is something that US multinationals and European multinationals and Japanese and Chinese multinationals, that's their lifeblood. Innovation and sales of new products, not scaling up low-cost items. And that's where the division of labor in these global supply chains has been really important. A lot of people have looked at these shortages, and there's a certain Fortress America, Fortress Europe, Fortress Asia group that says, bring everything back home. See, this is the problem of international supply chains. You become too dependent on other countries for critical things that you need. And I think it makes us rethink our priorities. I don't think there is a retreat from globalization in the sense that it's a good idea to bring all production back into the US, and we want to rebuild our manufacturing workforce and all of that. Manufacturing and the future of manufacturing and the future of work is a really great topic and something we can consider going forward, but we have to remember that even at its peak, manufacturing was only about 28% of the US workforce, 30% as we were in wartime years. Services and high-tech goods are much, much more important. So I think part of the way we compete with China is to think about how to develop more resilient supply chains, even in the wake of a pandemic. And so this chart, this slide gives us a few ways that people are thinking about it. We know that rigidity in terms of the cost-effective model of relying on one or two countries that can produce large quantities cheaply creates too many risks because, and we've seen why with the pandemic. So what are some of the options we have to make supply chains more resilient? Well, one is make them more domestic, bring production back home. That's reshoring or stockpiles, as we just discussed with face masks. Another is to make supply chains shorter. So instead of just thinking about supply chains that are linked between the US and Asia, we might be thinking about the North American supply chains, or Europe is thinking about European. And in fact, a lot of the global value chain literature, in fact, one of its major findings, I think, is most international production is regional, not global. Countries are collaborating with nearby economies, not just the best place in the world to make something. And a third way to create more resilient supply chains is to make them more diversified. So it may be that we are relying on China for a very large share of our face masks or other key products, but we could also say, as many multinationals do, okay, we want a China +2 strategy or a China +3 strategy. You add on other countries that can supply the same good as another way to diversify risks. I think that there's a lot of discussion right now around reshoring, bringing things back. But I don't think that is by itself the right lesson. Some reshoring for sure, but not trying to bring everything back. When the Trump administration was, and I've interviewed a lot of the multinationals making the face mask and other things, and I would say to them, great, okay, you've ramped up your production. Now that what is your supply chain going to look like post COVID-19? And are you going to continue to produce at that level? And they're saying, absolutely not. These are commodity items, low price. We have absolutely no reason to focus our production facilities in the US on those goods if we can get them for 1/5 the cost from Asia. Plus, if you think about it from a healthcare point of view, hospitals and medical centers are all cash strapped. They're the ones that drove the production shift into Asia to begin with, because they wanted to be able to have their dollars go further. So the cost, the bottom line in terms of cost is a big deal from a corporate point of view. They want to focus on higher tech, more profitable items, and also areas where their innovation can make sense. So it doesn't make any sense to just make low cost items. And in terms of stockpiles, we just saw what happened with the ventilators. You overestimate, now you got 95,000 ventilators. Before the H1 crisis in 2008, we had, 80,000 face masks. We used a lot of them up. We never replenished the stockpile. Stockpiles have to be maintained. So I think the smart way, and this is something President Biden has just done, is if you want to say, what do we reshore? You bring together private sector, public sector experts, and you think about key industries on which US security relies. So on February 24th, I don't know how many of us remember seeing it, President Biden announced he was setting up 4 panels to review supply chain strategies for the US in 4 areas. One of them was semiconductors. A second area was pharmaceuticals and active ingredients. A third area was batteries for electric vehicles. And a fourth area was critical minerals or rare earth minerals for electronic goods. To me, that's the way you do it. In other words, undoubtedly, those 4 panels are going to come up with recommendations on what kind of production we might want to have in the US in those strategic areas that are industries of the future, not industries of the past. So I just think that it does, And in addition, if you were to try to bring a lot of this production back to the US, it actually makes us more vulnerable, not less. Part of this idea of distributing production to other countries is it's a way to diversify and reduce risk. The article that you mentioned by Shannon O'Neill that came out in Foreign Policy, I think introduces a really smart strategy. The title is Supply Chains Are Now National Security. But the argument isn't that we go from these globalized supply chains to a national fortress, but it's that we think about regional supply chains as the approach of the future. That's this idea of making them shorter and more diversified. So if we think, and this is where trade agreements become very important. If we think about the North American Free Trade Agreement and the US automobile industry, the US has an incredibly strong automobile industry because of our collaboration with Mexico and Canada. It's an industry that, if you look at aerospace industry, Airbus in Europe, it's a critical industry for Europe, but it's spread across 8 or 10 countries. If you look at electronics in Asia, it's spread across East Asia. So I think either a regional model where you're dealing with neighboring economies, or a strategic partners model where you identify other countries like South Korea or Japan or whatever that we have strategic interest in collaborating with. So this kind of goes to a big difference, I think, between the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. You know, I've seen titles of publications like America First is America Last. If you just make the United States first and you go back to that fortress model, we really run the risk of being outflanked by technology change and lots of other factors. I think if we go to a kind of shared production model, but with strategic partners, that helps us to deal with these issues of creating more diversified or shorter supply chains that reduce some of the vulnerability of the long-term supply chains, but still some critical reshoring should take place. I think that'll help national security, but it's not necessarily going to help manufacturing, because the manufacturing nowadays doesn't create that many jobs. We just ask ourselves, why aren't any smartphones made in the United States? We're one of the biggest consumers. Apple is the leading designer of the smartphones, yet none of them are made here. Well, it's a product that has 500 or more parts. To do that kind of footprint for the parts as well as the final assembly, a lot of that has been done in Asia because that's where the part supply is. Our automobile industry in North America is incredibly powerful. Same with Boeing, but it's because the parts industries are also located nearby. So you can't have a resilient supply chain unless you have all the key parts within accessible to the final goods makers.
Okay, so in our last few minutes, I just wanted to see if there were any questions from people in the chat. So if anyone would like to post a question, now would be the opportunity to do that. Let me see, I do have a couple questions from students. So Kate is asking if you are sort of equating supply chain resiliency with the end of globalization, but what I'm hearing is that supply chain resilience means kind of a restructuring of globalization as we know it.
I think that's exactly right. I think we have to rethink how globalization is structured and how to create diversification without overdependence. And I think we can do that. So it's not the end of globalization.
So I wanted to wrap up here. You had kind of put some of these open-ended questions on this slide, and I think this is maybe a good place to conclude here. So maybe you can touch on,
Sure.
I like this question, resilience for whom?
Exactly, and I think one takeaway from COVID-19, with a global pandemic of that scope, nobody's ready for it. As we saw, even China wasn't ready those first couple of months, and it had to reorient production. So it means we've got to be able to deal with disruptions in terms of a strategy that allows us to flexibly move forward. I do think these are important open questions that we will be discussing, I think, in the next couple of years and trying to come up with good answers for. The resilience for whom, there is that firm level question about risk management. And companies always are taking that into account. But there are political goals that are different from that, like bringing jobs back home, or how do you introduce national security for certain kinds of products like pharmaceuticals that might be wholly outsourced to another place. So resilience might look different from a national perspective than from a corporate perspective, even though the two might overlap a bit. As we were saying, reshoring itself, bringing production back inside a single country's borders, doesn't guarantee either resilience or efficiency, but some kind of selective internationalization of production, I think at a regional level makes sense, especially because those economies are interdependent and have different resource endowments. I think firms versus GVCs is important. There's international business scholars have looked a lot at multinational enterprises as an organizational entity, but the global value chains approach that I've worked on a lot is really showing how a lot of these multinationals, they may be lead firms, but the critical structure of the chain has to do with who your first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers are and where those are located. So I think we need to be thinking about these questions with a supply chain framework, not an individual company framework. As we mentioned earlier, innovation, I think, is critical. This is definitely a key problem for vaccines, but we also have to ask about questions like vaccine nationalism. We might have innovation that's going to produce vaccines, but we also know that the number of countries capable of actually manufacturing a vaccine is something like a dozen. The number of countries who need vaccines desperately, as we know, are in the hundreds. So therefore, we have to come up with approaches. I think World Health Organization has actually developed a scheme called COVAX, and I saw that President Biden announced that US will contribute $4 billion to that, structured over a couple of different time periods to make sure it's used well, and other countries will as well. So I think we have to look at a global framework and say, what's global supply and demand look like, and not be short-sighted in terms of just what's good for us in a particular place. And I think this political landscape is really key. The fact that we've been so sensitized over the past year plus of dealing with these health and security and education challenges means that our thinking after the crisis is going to be very different. I mean, people are still saying, well, am I going to go into a big stadium again? Am I going to go into restaurants? So I think post-COVID there's going to be a new normal, not an old normal. We can't just roll back the clock and say, what were things like in 2019? I think we're going to have to be pretty creative in developing strategies going forward that are going to be informed by 2020, early 2021, but hopefully be quite different and more resilient and more sustainable.
So I'm going to cut us off there because we are out of time. It's been a fascinating hour. There's so much more that I could ask you, and the students could too. You were right, an hour flew by quickly. So just as a reminder to my Global Disruption students, we're going to meet at 2 o'clock in our regular Zoom room to continue our discussion. And for everybody else, I really want to thank you for joining us today. In the announcement for this event, there were some links to a few of Dr. Gereffi's articles. You might want to take a look at those, and I'd also recommend his most recent book on global value chains and development. And with that, Dr. Gereffi, GW-CIBER, and everyone who attended, thank you very much for joining us for this fascinating discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Laura. That's been great.